Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Unmuted, where today we're talking about something very special. I wanted to first originally talk about the healthcare issue with British Columbia and the nursing crisis in British Columbia, but I may talk about that another day this week. But something that really I wanted to get through because it was an experience I had this week of seeing a bunch of activists take on an event for an issue this week and for the opioid crisis. And something I did want to go through between activism and advocacy, because there's a difference. I know some people may not believe there is a difference, and believe it or not, one is definitely more effective than the other, and it tends to be the one people don't want to go through because they feel it might not be the best change. But something I'm definitely looking forward to getting into today. So yeah, I mean, this week there I happened to go across and see that there was a rally for something involving the opioid crisis and what was said and the challenges and what was going through, and it made me think, frankly, I think being an activist is easy. And that's someone coming from who, and believe me, I sometimes want to go the route of activism because it seems more powering than advocacy. But from what I found, and especially, someone who's dealt with a lot of activists or people who want activism to, use activism to try and bring change. I have a lot of experience working in the government, so I talk and see these people quite on the regular. And I find it problematic for a few reasons. One, it's heavily antagonizing. And I don't know about most people who are viewing this, but when someone's antagonizing or even downright threatening, I mean, let's look at environmentalist activists like David Suzuki, who threatened to blow up a pipeline for the sake of the environment. That's activism. And especially environmental activists are quite dangerous. For example, I find sometimes have no care for human life whatsoever. Like, let's use the forestry industry, for example. So there's something called tree spiking. If you haven't heard what this is, essentially what environmental activists will do is go into forests, put railroad spikes and spike a bunch in a tree. So when the loggers come in to cut down the trees, when the chainsaw hits the spike, the chain will come back at essentially them and either maim them terribly or kill them, because you have a spinning chain that's meant to cut down a tree, and when it goes back in your face, it probably will kill you. And if it hits your face, you're probably dead. If it hits somewhere else, like probably lose a limb, even possibly. But again, this is the work of activism. It's aggressive, it's usually full of anger, and it usually sits to threaten, antagonize, and really attacks people. And as someone who's worked for members of parliament, public service, and even, in other various fields, um, I can tell you one thing that never gets anyone in wanting to be involved in an issue is activism. And I think we turn to it mainly, first of all, because as I said, it's easy. Activism's easy. Being angry is easy. Being antagonizing is easy. Threatening people to take action, or else this is going to happen. I hear it on a daily basis. If something doesn't happen, the country's going to revolt. And I hear it on a number of different times of issues. On when I've worked for in a public office for members of parliament and such. But and sometimes the easy thing isn't the best thing. And I learned that from experience. And believe me, I understand where most people come from, especially when it's a passionate issue. Like, for example, if it's an issue, for example, in the opioid crisis or the drug crisis, when you've lost a loved one, you want action now. And believe me, I get that 100%. I want action done today, if possible, on the ALS front, on many different kind of front, the MS front, and many other similar diseases like it. But when one turns to activism, it becomes tasteless. You know what I mean? It leaves a bad taste in the mouth. Maybe that's something else, because I know a lot of people, especially those more on the left leaning side of things, love to go activism, especially with the online frontier style justice today. And that's unfortunately let's just be honest, social media has too much power and how people are affected on social media. And who knows, I'm probably going to be next on lynching mob just by saying that, but it's the truth. And it's interesting to me that we give activists way too much power right now. And I don't know about you, but when you get antagonized or threatened or told I'm gonna, you know, mess up your world if you don't do this, I'm not inclined to work with you. Why antagonize the people who work with you? In this event, they had no fear in attacking anyone. The mayor, the MLA, the member of parliament, they wanted to totally say, I think the words, and I quote, "We're going to drop the world on your effing head." Is that really the best way to get people involved? Really? Really doing that? Threatening and antagonizing? That's going to get people involved? It's never appealed to me personally. And being on the offensive has its merits at some point. I mean, let's look at the communist revolution in Russia. They were definitely on the offensive. The problem with activists is eventually, a good example of that is the French Revolution. How about the French Revolution? And that surely turned on the leaders of the French Revolution. They were activists for change away from the monarchy. And eventually, the leaders of the French Revolution found themselves on the heads of the guillotine. And that's, I think, becomes the endpoint of activism. And we even see it sometimes. The people who first were championing some ideas on the activist stage eventually end up on the chopping block themselves. Because eventually someone's going to come with an idea that says, well, this person started okay, but we needed to push it further and they're not willing to do it. So we need to get rid of them or cancel them or, in the sense of history, kill them. Um, and that happens all the time in historical revolutions led by these activist movements. Not just the Russian Revolution, not just the Russian Revolution, but the French Revolution. Usually, revolutions have a few turns of killing a lot of people. I think the only one that doesn't is the Industrial Revolution. Well, I guess you can find some people that could have been killed during that. Child labor and all was at a rampant high. But usually revolutions, I've never heard of a non-violent, bloody, and long term of bloody revolutions. We can look at a lot of South African countries, China, Cuba, sorry, South American, not South African. Apologies. But activism doesn't doesn't lead to where you think it will. I mean, it sounds it sounds like it'll get things done, but in fact, it may actually end up worsening things than they actually do. Which is why I hate activism. I do. I hate it to a passion because I don't think it solves problems. I think it just creates new ones. Even if you solve the problem, you've created a new one. And yes, I'm using extreme examples here, but I guarantee you most of these revolutionary ideas and activists start on very small scale. For example, using one person's works and it turns into something violent because activists tend to take on more violent natures. It's just how it goes. And history has proven that time and time and time again. Don't believe me? Go look it up. Go look up the French Revolution. Go look up the Russian Revolution and how the Soviets took over. None of this. I have never yet seen a revolution in history that it always starts on the small scale, right? Small thing. We're doing this for the people, and it turns out it's not really that. And I believe most activists, do things off for good intentions, but it ends up bloody. And I know I'm using extreme examples here, and I'm not comparing current modern activists to the French Revolution or Soviet Union. Don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing that and to these revolutions, but they all start on small scale. But it's a turn that these things can go violent. I mean, as like an example, environmental activists already get violent, ironically enough, because apparently certain things are more important than human lives, and they're not afraid to make threats and even kill people in the process. And believe me, my dad was in the forestry industry. I know what I'm talking about on that one, because I remember he told me and I was horrified to learn about that. And it's crazy, it happens. And uh, it should be, man, it's just terrible. And that's actually probably can also cause forest fires, because you kill the tree and now it's rotting and you can't cut it down because it has a bunch of spikes in it. So yeah. Anyways, back to my point. Back to my point. So if activism is the problem, which I do think it is, um, which I do think it is, what's the solution? Because I hate going into things just pointing fingers and blaming things. Because that's, again, like what I've said before, that's the easy way out. It's easy to sit and point fingers. We see it all the time on social media. It's easy to sit and point a finger and say, well, that's happening because of that. And okay. So that's why when I really do think of this stuff, I like to think of a solution. And the solution for activism is advocacy. And it is quite the opposite, believe me. And I too have thought about activism on my fight with ALS, but I think about it and think I want people to help me, not rally a bunch of people to attack those who can actually make a difference. And no matter how you feel about politicians, they do have the power to make change. And while it may be easy to sit and blame them for a lot of problems, Lord knows I get those calls almost every day working for a member of parliament, that we get calls blaming things for the simplest of things, even if it's not even their jurisdiction. But how does that help? How does antagonizing politicians, blaming them for things, how does it help? And sitting pointing the finger, and that's what activism is. It's sitting pointing a finger but not doing anything, not offering change, not offering to be different in a way, just sitting saying, this is a problem and you're not doing anything. And where advocacy can come in is, and I found this out through my Racer 338. And no, I was saying it's not the perfect solution. There are people who ignore advocates. There are some people who respond to activists because they're more threatening. But I guarantee you, if I went in with the attitude, and I have 29 MPs right now on board willing to help fight ALS. And I guarantee you, if I used threatening means, that number would probably be maybe three. Maybe. And that's being a very liberal number. I think it would actually be zero. Because who wants to deal with someone that threatens and antagonizes and blames? Nobody. We don't like to be yelled at. We don't like to be threatened at. And believe me, MPs are actually quite reasonable people, and MLAs as well, and city councilors and mayors. If we talk to them like people, human beings, because they are. I know it's easy, sometimes even fun, to make cracks at politicians and call them wrong or call them corrupt, whatever. And I'm not saying there isn't any corrupt politicians. For sure, you're going to find corrupt people who take advantage of a political system. Again, it's historically accurate, and I'm sure there today are politicians who don't give two craps about the world and and just do it for their own gain. Sure, they're out there. But I think for most people get involved in politics, they want to change things. I truly believe that. But sometimes I think it can be disheartening to learn that in a democracy, You can't just change things at the snap of your finger. And it can be disheartening because you may want to change this, but you can't. And you may even find out people don't even agree with your idea, even though you think it might be a good idea. Now, you can take the activism route. And I know some MPs and some politicians, even in the US, are famous for going the activism route. And they tend just to piss people off. They tend to leave a bad taste in their mouth. And why do I want to work with you if you're going to be so antagonistic? And the one thing about being a history major like myself, I studied history, is you get to learn from people, the cooperative people, the people who may change not through means of violence, but means of not even necessarily just compassion, but means of cooperation. And that's what advocacy is. It's pointing out the problem and bringing forth a solution, which I find is far more effective. Far more effective. Because when I meet with someone and talk about ALS, I don't talk about the negative. I talk about what we can do and what's available and why we need to bring it in. An activist would go and say, this is what's wrong with the world, and these people need to be held accountable. Which, don't get me wrong, I I sometimes have feelings of that too, where these people need to be held accountable. And it can be frustrating when things don't happen right away. But what people need to realize is in a democracy, things don't just happen right away. We need to talk about things. There are some things that can get passed pretty quickly. That we all agree on. You know, I'm sure I could say something and we could all agree on it, or at least, well, I don't know if you'll ever get in a world where you get 100% agreement on one particular issue. But I think there are many issues that the majority can agree on. Um, but even though the majority agree on it, you need to talk about the solutions. I had a really great conversation with one member of parliament. Our solution that we want MPs to do is, for example, for ALS, and just giving an example, we wanted a 3-month processing time. Well, the MP agreed we need to quickly pass process. I'm not going to say the MP's name just because I don't want him to get any crap for it. But and I didn't agree with his answer. But these conversations are important, and it's good to have these conversations. And the whole point of my campaign is with 338, Race to 338, is not about being negative. Because who wants to get on board a campaign that's about negativity? And you know, it's frankly something I see a problem in modern politics today, as we just focus on the negative instead of the positive. And it's so easy to take the negative route. Believe me, I think it constantly in certain issues. But when I actually meet with people, I try and find the solution, not point out the problem. Now, in a sense of advocacy, you point out a problem. But the difference between advocacy and activism is where activists point out the problem, then they threaten to get it done. Advocates point out the problem and find out what solution is available and what needs to be replaced by it. Now, I'm sure not everyone's going to agree with my definition on activism and advocacy, but that's what I have seen it become. And as myself, who's seen this a lot in working in public office, working in a public office, in a government office, I should say. Uh, um, it's and of course on campaign trails. I've worked on plenty of elections, and it's something you see a lot. And I mean, you even see it in politicians. And I mean, a Canadian example, um, I can talk to my head, people like Maxime Bernier. And, the PPC party is an activist party that want immediate change on issues. And unfortunately, which is the sad part, is Maxime Bernier was a member of parliament, even a minister, and understands these things. But his supporters, I don't think most people, I think, don't understand how the House of Commons works and how the Westminster system works. And to many, it feels too slow. But sometimes slowness is good. We question what we do, and that's not a bad thing. And that's something I've been seeing lately, that we dare to question something, or we dare to just ask why, or we dare to even say, well, let's talk about it. And it becomes a problem, which I don't know why. I remember back in, when I was in elementary school, that's how we solved problems, was talking it through. The hypothesis method, when I was in elementary school learning the basics of science, was you need to question it and go through probably different examples. And that's what I learned in basic science in my elementary and early high school. Was the whole point of science was to question and to find the truth of the matter. But now I feel that's no longer being taught to people anymore, to truly question things and talk about it. For some reason, it's wrong, and I don't know why. And unfortunately, the activism side of things does that. It's, I'm going to do what I think is right, but I want no opposition to it. And in my experience, that's what activists do, is they push through an ultimate force and want to push things through without any opposition. And me being an advocate for ALS, for example, I face opposition to some stuff. As I said, an MP did not like my 3-month proposal for treatment approval for rare terminal illnesses. Um, and he wanted a longer review of it. Well, I could have sit there and argued with him saying he was wrong. But what good would that do? I'm sure the activist in me wanted to say that to him. But part of me also knew that that would get us nowhere except a conflict, and I'd probably lose someone that could be a great help to me in the future. As I said, and I still stick to this, activism's easy. It's the easy, and sometimes I even say, I wouldn't go that far, but it's the easy way out. It's the easy way of dealing with solutions. And I get disheartened when people let anger and their emotions rule what's truly best for society. And grief is usually a big part of activism sometimes, especially when we're talking about, I stuff like, the opioid crisis has cost lives, right? And people who die from drugs. It's terrible. But unfortunately, a thing like grief can push activism. But again, activism isn't a solution. It creates more problems, in my opinion, in my observation. And again, people are probably going to disagree with me on this. But I think it needs to be said for us to really question how we move forward on issues. Do we continue to not question some people? It can be scary sometimes. I think about it when I think about history and how some things start off so small and they can turn into some terrifying forces. But that's why I think we need to start promoting advocacy. It's something we need to start sharing more of, because it does work. Believe me, it works. For example, usually advocates are in the form in politics, what you would call lobbyists. Lobbyists are usually people who are paid by either organizations or groups. So, for example, the farmers lobby. Farmers have lobbyists. The pharmaceutical companies have lobbyists. The dairy industry, I'm sure, has lobbyists. Um, I'm sure steelworkers and unions and all the forest industry. I'm sure all these people have lobbyists had to come work. And frankly, I'm actually right now, one of the biggest conversations I have with ALS groups right now is to get lobbyists. Because who cares if celebrities are on your side if you're not having someone in Ottawa talking to politicians to make policy, and lobbyists make differences. But these aren't people who necessarily threaten. Sometimes there are threats laid. For example, in usually in bills that involve agriculture, the threat usually is, we're just not going to vote. We're going to make sure you don't get reelected. And in rural communities, that's a big threat. I believe there's a lot of, most rural communities have farming. Let's be honest. But they say we need this, and the consequences are going to be dire. But um, if you don't vote for this, we're going to campaign against you. Essentially, is what lobbyists do. Lobbyists, I think, are a medium between activism and advocacy, but I think more on the side of advocacy, because they help sponsor things and promote things and bills, or say we don't like this bill, but we don't like it. I find activists threaten more anything, but the main thing, as I said, the activists don't do is promote things. Some activists do. Believe me, not all activists are the same. Of course, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. Same with advocates. And as I said, using lobbyists as an example, they sometimes use threatening means. And these are advocates who have activist tendencies. And I think there are activists who have advocate tendencies. Believe me, there's always exceptions to the rule. And I'm sure there are people who are activists who don't take on a threatening persona, but a very aggressive stance. And good for those who don't take on a very violent or threatening stance on issues, but are very aggressive and pushy. Great to that, and I'd love to see who they are. But I mean, I've, at least in my experience, they're not highlighted as much. But that's what media does, and social media. They don't like to see the agreeable people. They want to see the drama, right? The drama in the world. That's what we want to see, because we love that for our entertainment. And that's what social media promotes. That's why you see people who are crazy. And maybe if my was a bit more crazier, this channel will probably be a bit more popular than it is. But I refuse to change who I am to get the messages that I believe need to be out. And I think many people, at least the people I talk to and see are talking, are getting almost a little annoyed with the craziness, and they want more reality, I think, in their content. And what what I'm trying to bring here is things that need to be highlighted more. It's the whole point of the channel, why I named it what I named it. And it's it's a shame to see how social media has become an online mob, almost in a lynching style. And unfortunately, activists do lead these charges online, which is not good, nor is it healthy for discussion, debate, and talking out of ideas. And that's one thing I think activists fail to do, is actually discuss ideas, where I think advocates, for the most part, again, this is in a general context. I know there's, again, and everyone's probably not going to agree with me on my definitions of advocacy versus activism, but that's been my experience, and I'm sure I'm not alone on this. And I actually think there are more people who want less conflict in our issues, and less craziness online and what we talk about. I see some of this stuff, and it makes people go crazy and frothing at the mouth, sometimes for no reason. And it's crazy, and it's something that I think we need to start honing in ourselves, to just take a step back and say, whoa, let's really look at structure, how we do things. And I think if we start listening to the advocates over the activists, where we will see, I think, a big change in how we do things, especially I think online. But when we treat people like people, no matter what else, you'd be surprised, I think, how things change, and how demeanor people can change when you don't treat them like, for example, treat a politician like a politician, but treat them like a human being. And every person I meet with when I'm on my campaign Race to 338, I don't look at a politician by their party, or necessarily as a politician. I look at them as someone who can help bring change to thousands of Canadians suffering, and even help, for example, save thousands of lives in Canada alone. And it frustrates me when people use tools like threatening, or like just pure anger towards someone because something's not being done right away, is so disheartening, and it gets us nowhere. It gets us nowhere but more conflict and division. And that's what I truly believe activists do. They divide people, not unite them. And that's something I hate to see, because we're already divided enough, not just even as in Canada, but as a human race. I think we're probably one of the most divisive points, at least in the Western world, in I think modern history. And I think it's taking its toll. And I think activism doesn't help. And I think what we can learn from advocacy is sitting down and talking about solutions, not continuing to point out the problems. Here's the thing: we already know the problems. We see the problems every day. It's not like the media ignores problems. Sure, they do ignore some problems, but I mean, I could say for ALS, they certainly ignore the problems, but because it's just not big enough, and not enough people are affected. But we see things, and we already know problems are being pointed out. I don't need someone. I don't need a kid on Twitter to point out the problem that there's a problem with the environment. I see that everywhere. A 30,000 person pointing out the same problem isn't going to help me, or that or some sort of Instagrammer saying we need to do better. Well, how about instead of pointing out problems, we actually find solutions to these problems? And that's actually, I think, the biggest failure of parties like the Green Party, a party who their only really platforms I've seen is just pointing fingers and blaming people. I just don't know. So, and the solutions are, we're just going to cut industry. That's actually in Canada, essentially in the Green Party in Canada, that's actually not going to solve the climate crisis. It's going to not even do any effect to the world whatsoever. Um, Believe me, if Canada would cut all industry tomorrow, the world would save 1.2 carbon emissions, and I think that's being pretty liberal with the numbers. But beyond that, but it's an example, right? Like it's easy to sit and point fingers, easy to sit and point problems. That's why I say activism's easy. You just sit and point problems and demand change. You don't offer any solution, you just demand change. Some activists want radical solutions in some ways, and some do offer solutions. But again, they also will antagonize those who aren't doing it right away. And reality is, especially in a democracy, is things don't change quickly. It's just the way things go. If you want things to change quickly, you're going to have some sort of totalitarian government where you don't get a say, and you probably wouldn't get to protest or have rallies for these issues. You'd have to shut up and sit at home. Sure, the one thing you care about gets dealt with, but how about the things you don't like that this government does, and you don't get a say in how these things get resolved anymore? That's the line we got to balance. Democracy is not perfect, but you can sit there. You should be actually thankful for the system we have, because there are many people around the world, like look at China, North Korea, Cuba, and Russia, who don't have a say in how their country's managed. They have to sit and let totalitarian regimes, and they don't get to protest in those countries. You protest, you don't get seen in the light of day ever again. So I think to those who want to take activism up and want immediate change, I think we need to learn our system better first. Before you demand change, learn how the system works and make change through that system. And I think that's where advocacy comes in, because it is the solution to activism. We need to see problems but have solutions, not just point out problems. It's easy to point out problems. It's, for example, it's like taking your car in and yelling at the mechanic because you point out problems, but he's not fixing it. And you might not even think you pointing out a problem might not even be a real problem. And he can go in and actually look at it from a different angle and say, well, no, that's not the problem. This is actually the problem, and this is the solution to that problem. There are some people who think there is a solution to it, and it's not a real solution. But that's why discussion is important, so we can talk about these ideas to find solutions. And that's, I think, where, as I said, advocacy can come in and make a total difference on how we see the world and how we can come to solutions. Um, you're never going to please everyone. That's something I've sure learned in my short 25, 26 years, sorry, of life is you're not pleasing everyone. And to try to please everyone will ultimately end in failure. There's historical examples of that. Look at Wilfrid Laurier, totally in the I think it was the 1905 election. I may have got my years wrong, but it was definitely the early 1900s. Totally got obliterated because he tried to please both, English and French speakers, because that was the biggest division in Canada at the time, and ended up annoying both sides and totally got obliterated in the election. A historical example, very fun to learn. Apologies if I bored anyone with that, but just an example of you can't please everyone, and trying to do so, pretending to please everyone, is just going to end up annoying people. And we need to work things out. And I'm going to be a broken record, and I think that's advocacy. I think it's important to talk about these issues. And one thing I will say for advocates is they get these issues out for sure. And it's more exciting to be an activist. But I don't think you get much done. I really don't. I think you just antagonize people, you anger people, you divide people in the end, and you just create more hostilities, not solutions. And it's easy. As I said, activism's easy. It's the easy side of change, especially if you're a very pushy, aggressive, and violent activist. It's something I don't strive to ever become, and will never, hopefully, never become. You never say never on some things for certain people, but it's something I will never strive to become, because I believe in solutions, in true solutions, talking it out with people, and joining with people to make change, not blaming them for not having to make change yet. That, I think, is the hard thing to do, is to swallow our pride and swallow, frankly, our anger, and say, I want to work with you. And sometimes it's going to be rough. People aren't going to always, even as an advocate, I have people who ignore me. I have people who tell me no. And you know what I do? I could go to social media and blast these people to the moon. Believe me, and it probably would work. But what does that do? It doesn't do anything. Sure, you can put these people on blast, but what does it do? They become unelected. Sure, maybe your goal is to make sure they're not in parliament anymore. Great. What has that accomplished? You've accomplished nothing. And if you worked with that person, rather than either harass them or antagonize them or boot them out for some reason, that does nothing. But now you have to go against the next guy. And what if the next guy is even worse? And you can't get rid of him. Right? These are things most people just don't think about. They just think about in the negative side of things. And as I said, for most part, grief can absolutely manifest this. And we can let that control us, or we can use that grief for real change, not just anger and finger pointing. And I think that's the problem, especially with the opioid crisis and a lot of these medical deaths, is people just point and blame. And I understand it. Sometimes I want to take that route myself. But as you know, I've been told, in the past before, sometimes the easy path is not the best one. And I think that's true for this case, especially. Sometimes it might be. Who knows? It's hard to say. But I think it's something we all need to work on is being advocates over activists and working on solutions, including myself. I don't always am the advocate. This is a message not as someone who has mastered this, but someone who continues to work on it and someone who also needs to do better, like I think everyone else. And if this can help one person, even one person, look at it and go to a more positive light of change, then I think this whole video and this whole experiment of this podcast will be worth it. And just changing one person, I think will, as I said, be worth it. And I know not a lot of people watch this stuff. And I hope one day enough people will and see how important these issues are. And some days it can be disheartening. But as I said, the easy way is not always the best, and the easy way to quit. And if there's one thing I don't do, it's quit something when I've started. So um, let us continue together to work and advocate for issues and advocate for positive outlooks of change and work together to get these things done. Because as Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand. And that applies, I think, to so many things that we forget those wise words that, we can't do things divided and build things while we're divided. Only when we take on these issues together and seek to solve them as one body can we actually create positive and hopeful change to the world. And I hope if there's anything anyone can take out, at least of this video, is um, advocate what you're passionate for. Work with people because I guarantee you, the more positive your message, the more people you'll attract. You'll catch more flies with honey than vinegar, right? Uh, the old adage, and how true it is, believe me. On my own, working on this campaign, 29 MPs. Almost 3 years ago, I had only three, and it's almost times by 10. Sometimes this route can be slow, but sometimes, as we see the tortoise and the hare, the tortoise always wins. And I think in this case, this is the truth. I think to these kind of issues, there is no quick solution because I don't think enough people understand, at least in the sense of ALS, what that's like. And I hope no one else has to. I really, I know with some issues, and I've seen activists say, I hope it was so terrible. I hope the politicians' children suffer what I had to suffer as a mother. I remember one saying, I think on a drug issue, I can't remember exactly. I can never imagine saying that, especially even if it was a drug thing. It's just a horrible thing to say. And when it comes to ALS, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy's father or my worst enemy for that matter to go through that, to go through what I had to go through. No one should have to go through. And that's what I hope to change in this. But the only way to do that is positive, hopeful change. And that's how we do that is not necessarily having to agree on everything, but agreeing to a solution to the problem and trying to find the best way forward. So let's continue to get the best way forward together, and hopefully we can come out this with positive outcomes. And remember, folks, that advocacy always is better than is mostly is better than activism. And I see that from experience personally. This may have been very divisive for some folks, and I'm sure some will disagree with me, and some will show me some examples of where activism worked. Um, Great. Let's have that discussion. Let's really have that discussion, because that's, I think, one of the points I want to make is, discussion for it. There's so much to talk about in our world today that it's hard and to not go through everything. But I can guarantee you one thing we do want to catch on, which I'll probably talk about next week, is the nursing crisis, at least in British Columbia, but I think it's across Canada. I think it's across Canada. I'll be talking about that later this week. Very excited to talk about that, and something we definitely need to talk about because it is a problem. We are out of nurses. And I don't think the government knows what they are doing. And by the government, I mean the BC government and the Canadian government at this point. But something we're doing to talk about later this week. So, very happy to go over that. Maybe even have a special nurse guest or first responder guest. We'll see. But I'll definitely be talking about it at the very least. Thank you, everyone. And let's keep unmuting the issues. Thanks.